have a confession to make. I am terrified of octopuses.
We'll go with vampire. That'll be safer.
I think what I have learned is that I enjoy vampires when they're gay.
Octopus fact time.
Octopus facts!
I mean, that's what we do on this podcast. We just make stuff up with a good argument.
We are the octopus, and the octopus is us.
In the face of horror, we often default to being normal about it.
I mean, how many times have either of us watched a film or something and identified with the monster?
Is it spooky? Is there a castle? Did a woman faint? Ah, it must be gothic.
Metaphors and pretty sentences and a giant monster at the end.
Welcome to The Vampire and the Octopus.
A series by Book Club with Julia.
And Victoria.
Two nerds whose friendship consists primarily of exchanging fun facts back and forth until the end of time. Victoria has promised me multiple fun facts, and that is why I am here with you today.
Not for the friendship, just for the fun facts.
Exactly.
This podcast is all about the books we just can't shut up about.
And this week, we are getting into the second anthology episode of our new series with a look at vampire literature as a whole. So last episode, we did octopus literature, kraken literature with me. And today, we're doing vampire literature with Victoria. And then after this, we'll get into some specific vampire novels throughout the series.
There are some mild spoilers ahead for classic vampire novels. We're not really going to get into anything later than 1922. So you've had 100 years, your entire lifespan to get to these things. So some mild spoilers for things like Dracula ahead, but nothing too surprising.
If you'd like to support the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on whatever podcast platform you're listening to us on. And if you are buying any books, if you go down to any books that are linked in our show notes, that takes you to our bookshop.org page, where we've actually got a bunch of lists of every single book that we've covered on this show, plus some personal lists. I have an Autism Feels book list. Victoria has a starter pack for graphic literature, and we get a very small kickback when you buy from that site. And then if you want to join the club and support us, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv, also linked below. That is our Buy Me a Coffee page where you can support us for as little as $3 a month. As we're releasing this series, we did so much research, and only a fraction of it is making it into the show. We did so much research. And so we'll be putting together kind of bonus content for our Buy Me a Coffee members on all the things that we learned in preparing for this series, in addition to what actually made it into the final cut. Because, we could talk for another 4 hours just on these intro episodes. 4 months of reading each. So keep an eye out for that coming soon alongside the regular episodes. So
let's get into it.
What do you have for us today, V?
Okay, so I just want to create a mind map around what is a vampire? What are the traits of a vampire? When I say vampire, what do you think about?
The first thing I wrote down is allergic to the sun and garlic.
Great.
Not oh, these are things that will kill them, but they have a garlic allergy. I was trying to think, and I'm sure this is something that we will get into in extensive detail, but I was trying to separate, what are, the OG vampire things? Because we've covered Dracula, we've covered Carmilla, but all the vampire things are kind of lumped together in my brain. So I was being killed by a wooden stake, I don't know where that came in. Not being able to be seen in mirrors, I don't know when that came in. Obviously, drinking blood, that's, the number one, right? Because they don't make any blood themselves. They need to, survive. Sleeping in coffins. I feel like that's, a day one thing. But yeah, I'm not sure, which things are original and which things are more recent. And then, obviously, there's so many modern interpretations that are oh, I'm doing a fun spin on vampires. They don't actually burn, they sparkle. Or whatever the hell, right? So what else is there?
One thing that actually really helped me identify all these different tropes that I was forgetting about, or, you know, a lot of the modern vampire stories will pick and choose which ones they want to use, because honestly, a lot of them could be contradictory to each other. And one of my favorites is What We Do in the Shadows, the TV show. They hit on so many of these, especially in the first few episodes of season 1, because they're kind of laying the groundwork of like what kind of vampires they are in this TV show. But they do it in humorous ways. So you have things like they can't enter someone's house, or in What We Do in the Shadows, like any place, without being invited in. So they've got these silly scenes where they're like trying to like coax someone to be like, yeah, just step inside, dude. Like you said, we've got these wooden stakes repelled by garlic. The burning in the sun is really fascinating. We'll get into when that was introduced into this, but this is one that, I mean, it's a core part of being a vampire is something with sun. So every author, every storyteller is making a decision about like, are they straight up burning to a crisp, or are they just like mildly uncomfortable?
Right.
Or like you said, do they sparkle?
She's kind of the on one out on this one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That it like big asterisk here. I do not get into Twilight in this episode. It felt like beyond the scope of what I could do and how I wanted to talk about it. So that'll be some of the bonus content for our members over at Buy Me a Coffee. We'll get into Twilight more specifically. So we also have this idea of like immortality or living like a long ass time. Like they live longer than humans. Like you mentioned with them needing human blood, part of it too is they're also cold. And so while humans make their own blood and are warm-blooded, vampires have to leech from others, and they are cold to the touch. A lot of vampires have fangs. People are trying to figure out how the blood-sucking works, so they come up with different fang theories.
I always just imagine little straws in the fangs. Like, I know that's not what they would be called, but like that's basically how I've always imagined it.
Yeah, it's so funny because like humans... Like, we can suck on things, right? Like, from infancy, we know how to suck and, like, absorb nutrients that way. But for whatever reason, we've had to make it that, like, the fangs don't just pierce, but also must be the instrument with which they, like, suck it up. And it's like, they have a mouth. But there are so many vampire stories that use, like, some sort of special fang or sucker or something else that's happening. Beyond just the mouth. And lastly, on my list, and we'll probably come up with others throughout this episode that I forgot to list here, afraid of or repelled by or even destroyed by religious symbols. So a crucifix or being splashed with holy water. I think this one is really funny, especially in like modern vampire stuff, because almost every serious vampire novel is like, yeah, no. Like they have to address it. Yeah. Like the vampire at some point has to be like, yeah, that's not an issue. Or they make it really silly, like in What We Do in the Shadows, and they just hiss at it. And they're like, sss.
Yeah. They're so silly.
So thinking through this, our mind map, we've kind of discussed what could be a vampire, and we've centered around this idea of like they drink blood. Like that's like the core thing that they do. Yeah. What do you find, at least on first pass, most interesting? Is it straw-like fangs? Like what part of vampirism are you like fascinating, interesting to see how people play with that?
It's funny, I didn't really realize until I said it out loud that that's what I was always assuming was happening. I was just like, yeah, that makes sense, and didn't think anything more about it until I said it out loud. I was like, that's a really weird thing to assume. Oh my god. I mean, listen, we came of age in like peak Twilight, whatever, and I never got it. I never understood it. I was like, I would read excerpts of the books and I would watch the movies and I would just think it was the stupidest thing I've ever seen. And I didn't think, I realized they're an anomaly, like they're not really the center of vampireness. You know, there are, like, I loved the original What We Do in the Shadows. It was like one of my favorite movies in college, and I'm obsessed with the new Interview with the Vampire show. So like there is stuff that I really like of it. But I think I find the people who take the sort of vampire lore too seriously when they're adapting it, I think is what I maybe don't like. I really like what we're doing right now with this project, is looking at vampires as symbols, as like literary objects. I find that super fascinating. And I think that's what the new Interview with the Vampire show does super, super well, is it's like there's so many layers of meaning. And it's just this long extended metaphor. And so it's not really about them being vampires, that kind of thing. I really like like looking at these symbols to understand the kind of psychology of an era, like the place that vampires came from, the time that vampires came from. I find that super interesting, so I'm very excited to learn more about that. And I think the thing maybe that is most intriguing to me is them as a way to look at loneliness, actually. And like the more esoteric level, like our relationships to time and death and like the inherent loneliness of being the only person who's gonna live forever as everyone around you dies, like that. I don't know, there's the kind of isolation of the vampire, I think, is maybe what I have connected to the most over the years. So yeah, I enjoy it as like a thing to see other people and other times through. Or if it's the original What We Do in the Shadows, where they're just like absolutely taking the piss. You know what I mean? Like, and that is fun.
Yeah.
But I think it's partly because, you know, coming of age during the Twilight obsession, seeing everyone around me take it so seriously, I was like, guys, this is very silly. Like, can we just have fun with it? Do we have to like be so, I don't know. I was very confused by it.
Well, I mean, it's obvious that we're friends and we make a podcast together because I'm like, same girl, same. That's what this show is going to be about. But I do think it is interesting coming from the Twilight era. Like, for us, besides if you read like A to Z Mysteries, where there was like the V book had to be about vampires because like what other monster could there be?
Velociraptors.
The vultures are coming. We didn't really have any introduction yet to the long history of vampires in literature until Twilight. We get like werewolves in Harry Potter, so if you'd read that first, you might have been a bit into werewolf mythology, and they actually come from a similar like locale of folklore.
Yeah.
So they often come hand in hand. But yeah, so getting into Twilight and that being your first introduction of vampires, you don't know yet what tropes she's playing with as an author and which one she's like thrown out the window and what aspects are like, you know, pulling from other references.
Yeah.
And so that's what we'll get into in the members special on Twilight, because I said this wasn't an episode on Twilight, but of course
I'm
we
just
can't not
it up.
talk about it.
It's part of like our history, you know?
Yeah, it's where we started. And I think I also did not, like, I read all the Twilight books. I actually got grounded as a teenager because I didn't do my chores or homework all weekend because I was reading the fourth book. And so my dad grounded me from reading anything that wasn't for school for a week, which was fine because I had finished the series. So I'm like, great, I don't actually have anything left to read. I'll take a week off, catch up on my homework. That was the nerd that I was. But it was Dracula that got me back into, that reintroduced me to vampires in a way that I was like, this is fascinating.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of what I liked about Gothic literature. It was a starting place to like peek into this like decades-long history, centuries-long history of vampire storytelling and how we've continued to use these tropes to like make meaning of our lives in society.
Yeah.
Okay, so to lay the groundwork for our vampire discussions over the course of the Vampire and the Octopus series that we're putting together, I want to do 3 things in this episode. 1, sorry, syllabus time, here we go. 1, explore where vampire narratives come from. And then 2, we're going to take a tour through some of the first written down vampire narratives, specifically in Western European literature, and noting kind of the tropes that these early pieces established. And then thirdly, examining kind of 3 core themes, which I have, in the process of writing this outline today, expanded to 4. 4 core themes of vampires and vampire storytelling that we'll be investigating through the whole series. So ultimately, my goal here is to build a case for why I think vampires are one of the most versatile and fascinating monsters in literature. The lore is super deep and rich, and if you have all this context, you can really appreciate what an author is doing. And as I read way too many books to prepare for this, I was so excited to come across something, and it almost felt like not as rich and deep, but close of when you read something and you realize it's based off of like a Greek myth that you once studied and you love to see how it comes together.
Yeah.
Still a good story on its own, but now you have this extra layer of like, oh, they're riffing on this Greek myth. A lot of vampire novels are riffing off of these ideas. And so you can still enjoy a vampire novel. There's so many out there that are just like easy reads. You can come with very little context. And as long as the writing style matches your preferences, like you're probably in for a very good good time. But I hope you have more tools in your toolbox to enjoy the Easter eggs that come along the way.
So strap in, everybody. I am on the same journey as you, and I'm very excited.
So where do vampire narratives come from? So I spent, again, to reiterate, the amount of research that is not going to this episode, I spent a long time looking at folklore and mythologies of blood-sucking creatures around the world.
Yeah.
But then I was like, we have an hour. We're going to focus in on the Eastern European tradition of vampire folklore because that's where we get the vampire as we've described at the top of this episode. Right. So know that there's blood-sucking creatures everywhere. Almost every culture has something like this. And with blood being so vital to the human body and existing, and so visible too. You can see your veins. You cut someone, do they not bleed?
Yes.
It makes a lot of sense. So we have a lot of stories and folklore around our essence, our life. Mm-hmm. So evidence of vampires in the Slavic folklore tradition. So this is what we think now of like Russian, Ukrainian, Serbian, all of that Eastern European area. These beliefs date back to like the 9th century, but it's likely much older than that. We get written references in Old Russian in the 11th century.
Wow.
Yeah, very long ago. And it was one of those words in Old Russian that they used a symbol for the thing so as not to say the thing.
Like bear.
Yeah. Like we don't actually know what the word was. But in Old Russian, which I will not pronounce because I did not write down and I don't know how to say Old Russian, they had a stand-in word. But through context clues, we can understand that's what they were referring to.
Oh, wow.
Notably, this is happening relatively soon. I mean, relative is a strong word. Within the centuries that Orthodox Christianity is moving through and into Eastern Europe. So there's a really great book that I started reading, Slayers and Their Vampires, A Cultural History of Killing the Dead by Bruce A. McClelland. And someone else named Ashley M. Quinn summarized it in a better way than I could. So I'm going to read her quote. Actually, I'll have you read her quote.
Ooh, okay. McClellan argues that the Slavic word vampire had altogether different connotations when it was first used. In the 11th century, it was, quote, the label for an individual who either belonged to a specific group or practiced a particular belief or ritual. More specifically, vampire was used for certain people within the Slavic community who continued to practice certain pagan rituals, fascinating, in parentheses, sacrificial rites and rituals associated with reincarnation, end of parentheses, deemed unacceptable to Christians. Thus, early vampires were either pagans or heretics who occupied a lower social position. Wow, I'm learning so much. Okay, throughout the years... This is so fun. I'm continuing the quote here. Throughout the years, this definition of vampirism started to be connected with Satan and evil. Before the 14th century, vampirism was associated with real individuals who failed to convert properly to Christianity. The vampire, as representative of a real individual, started to change into the folkloric monster after the 14th century, at which time it began to represent all that was presumed to be unnaturally dangerous or anathematic. Fascinating.
Yeah, this was super exciting to read. I was trying to trace back, so where did the connotation with Christianity come from?
Yeah.
And it's from the beginning. From the point of, well, maybe not the beginning. As we said, we don't know exactly how far back this goes, but this idea of the other. As Christianity had more and more of a hold in this area, there became a need for words for people who were not Christian enough, who were not giving up the pagan rituals and beliefs. And then over time, eventually this morphs into just a monster for a lot of things you can't understand. And we see this follow through to a lot of vampire lore. And I'm totally jumping ahead of myself, but one of the core themes that I want to explore in this series is the idea of vampire as the invading foreigner, who's just othered in many ways, and doesn't fit the mold, and so is seen as outsider and coming in and wreaking havoc. So even though these original ideas of vampire were holding their old Slavic ideas and not converting to Christianity, from the Christian perspective, it was seen as a heresy, and you are this outside force that's pushing back against our holiness.
That's so interesting that it started as, or maybe it didn't start as a Slavic idea. Maybe it started as a missionary idea, someone from the outside coming in and labeling the people who don't convert as bad. But like, it starts as a Slavic idea, and then, but when the literature starts to pop up, it's Western Europeans being like, ew, look, Slavs.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it kind of gets turned on them, even though it's their lore. Like, the British stole their lore and said, ew, look at them.
You are jumping ahead, but I like where your brain is going. We will get there.
So, what happened next?
Continuing with the Slavic folklore into the centuries that follow the 14th, we get this more consistent idea as vampires as reanimated corpses that prey on the living. So we've now gone from vampires as a thing you call a person to a generalized monster to more specifically this idea of a reanimated corpse that preys on the living. This is almost, as I was reading about it, it seems a bit closer to our modern conception of the zombie than our modern vampire stories. Because yes, they're like collecting and drinking blood, they're called vampire, but they're also like attacking and eating animals such as like cows and horses, and they're basically seen as like a creature that's coming for you and yours. Might be coming for the people, might be coming for the animals, like indiscriminately eating things. And notably, vampires were also noted for spreading disease. So this is back, imagine you're in the 14th century, you don't know how bacteria and viruses work, have not seen them, but certain people just start falling ill, and then a whole house falls ill, and you're trying to come up with reasons why this might be happening. And in some ways, someone who's ill comes to your community, they might even be an outsider. All of a sudden, everyone's infected. And there's just humans trying to come up with stories for why things are happening. Some of the records that kind of point to, like, vampires continuing to be a common topic of conversation is recorded in, like, Serbian legal codes in the 14th century. The church and rulers of the time were trying to, like, tamp down vampire beliefs by banning what were called, vampire burials. So, trying to ban any method used that was supposed to keep a vampire from coming back by desecrating its grave or mutilating a corpse, burning it, beheading it, etc. And so the church and the rulers are trying to, like, tamp down this pagan behavior, and highlights this continual conflict between the idea of vampires and the church. There's a Slavic literature researcher, Stanley Stepanek, out of University of Virginia. I read a lot of his work for this. He's got some really great ideas. I love how he, like, cohesively explains them too in a way that doesn't feel like you're reading a research article. And he argues that this shows quite simply that the belief of the vampire was not just an old one, but a problem so significant that attempts were made to eradicate it. So often when we see, you know, like the church or rulers, people in power trying to, like, quash an idea, it's not just like a silly little thing that the people on the countryside believe, but it's like meaningfully uprooting their power in a way that they want to push back against it.
It makes you want to imagine, like, how this could possibly have threatened. Like, it's interesting that it evolved from a way of labeling someone who was not Christian to, like, the church feeling threatened by people continuing to be afraid of that non-Christian outsider. Like, you would think they would be behind it and be like, yeah, get rid of those people who don't believe the way we believe. But instead, they're threatened that people think they exist at all.
But remember, this is also happening between, like, the 9th and the 14th century.
Right, okay.
Like, this is 500 years of the idea of vampires changing and morphing, different rulers coming into power, the church going through its own waves of more or less power in certain areas. So yeah, this is, like, huge time summary.
Yeah.
The last, like, 10 minutes of this conversation is spanning 500 years. So we're gonna do another time jump.
All right.
We're now in the mid-18th century, and we have what is called the Great Vampire Epidemic. Julia, what do you think a Great Vampire Epidemic would be?
This was Victoria's teaser to me. She's like, I'm going to tell you all about the Great Vampire Epidemic, and I got so excited. So, I think I had heard something about vampire burials before in, like, an archaeology thing of people, like, digging up, like, this is what a vampire burial looks like. They're trying to keep them from coming back, whatever. So I think my brain made that kind of association. But I honestly, I imagine something kind of like the Salem witch trials, where it's like people are getting super paranoid and accusing each other of stuff, and maybe there's some stuff with graves. That's kind of my general image.
I would say your general impression is pretty spot on. So this started in, like, 1725. There was a case in Serbia where people in a community believed that there was a vampire that had appeared and caused illness. Again, this is folklore of the region. Not like the most notable thing, but another year later in 1726, there's another case of like, we think there's a vampire, it's causing illness, this is a problem. And now the rumors are starting to spread. However, we also have this time the German and Austrian soldiers fighting the Ottomans. I'm not going to get into the history of it because I don't actually remember much about this war. But what you need to know is there are Western Europeans in Eastern Europe at this time. And so they are hearing this hysteria of vampires that is spreading through Serbia, and they are taking those stories back home with them. And so there's some theories about what was happening. We think this might be a misunderstanding of how decomposition works. If you are so scared of these vampires coming back from the dead and you're digging up bodies, they look terrifying, right? Yeah. Hair and nails continue to grow after a body dies. The gums recede, so it makes, canines appear more like fangs. And fearing the vampire, and so they dig up corpses and they look terrifying, might be fuel to this fire. Other ideas might be that, with the times, there wasn't a great medical understanding. So, and this might be an older myth too, may not just be from this time period, this 18th century, of like someone going into a coma, but then coming back awake. And they might already be partially in the ground by then, or they might be like in the pile to be buried next. And they're like, I'm alive. So there's some ideas of like what might have been happening.
Was there also like, if you have this mixture of people from different places, was there like the diseases that were taking these villages, were they being brought back by these German soldiers at all? Not
that I know of specifically with the German and Austrian soldiers. From what I read, that was more just like how the stories were taken back to the West. Mm-hmm. But there were some other diseases specifically that people have speculated now might be medical explanations for why there was a breakout of vampire hysteria during this time specifically. So, people were digging up graves for a long time. People were going into comas and coming back awake for a very long time. But why in 1725, 26, and for about 30 years, was there this like vampire epidemic and hysteria?
Wow, that's a long time.
One theory is rabies. So there was, rabies has always been around, but sometimes you'll get a resurgence of it in certain places. You get a bite from an animal. Symptoms of having rabies can include fear of water, fear of light, altered sleep patterns, increased aggression. So if there's a lot of rabies cases happening, could be, like a lot of hysteria around that. Speaking of bringing things from one place to another, pellagra, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, is a disease that is often contracted from unwashed corn. So this was a disease introduced to the European continent during the Columbian Exchange when corn came to Europe. So around this time in the 18th century, where people were using corn that weren't used to it and didn't know things like you should wash it before eating it. And so pellagra has symptoms of dermatitis, which is like a skin condition, dementia, death, sometimes sunlight sensitivities. So yeah, if you aren't really connecting the dots of like, we started eating this new food and now we have like a bunch of people dying, you may not know why they're dying, and it could be like, theory is vampire. There was one other like medical explanation for vampires, or like where it might come from. This one wasn't associated specifically with the Great Vampire Epidemic in the 1725 to 55, but I wanted to bring it up because it comes up a lot when you're reading about like what might vampirism be like a symbol for, or people might think it is a vampire, but actually it's this. Porphyria. This theory was proposed in like the 1980s when more research was being done on this condition. It's a hereditary condition that causes the body to produce less of a component of hemoglobin. Notably, it can have symptoms of red urine and extreme sun sensitivity. It's also hereditary, so you'll see things like, oh, that's a family of vampires, because like they all live this way. But this is just a theory proposed of like, oh, perhaps people had this condition, they didn't know what to call it, they called it vampirism. Those are just, some of the theories that come up on like what it could be. I'm curious your thoughts on like medical explanations for like superstitions or stuff. Like, are they interesting to you? Do you hear this stuff and you're like, oh, that all makes sense? Or like, what do you typically think?
I think the phrasing of them is crucial because they can be very condescending. I'm not really interested in that.
Yeah.
But I think at the end of the day, I see them as kind of an act of like translation. if anything, it actually helps me. It makes me feel more connected to these people because it validates for me in the language that I'm used to in my current day that what they're experiencing is real. Right?
Mhm.
So, like, if you go to someone in this period and explain, like, bacteria to them, right? Or viruses, you're like, well, there's these tiny little creatures. There's these tiny little fairies that live in your saliva or in the air or in the food you eat, and they attack your body and your body fights it. And, like, I would sound insane to them. That wouldn't matter. Like, that wouldn't matter at all, you know? But if I started giving some kind of supernatural explanation that might have more weight, and they would be more inclined to believe me and actually, like, act on things. Like, folklore doesn't come from nowhere. You know what I mean? Like, it's people seeing patterns and putting stories on them, and a lot of times they have some kind of grounding in reality somewhere, and often keep people alive in some way. They can cause a lot of chaos sometimes, but like, so do our stories today. You know, political ideologies are stories, right? Those cause a lot of chaos. And so I just feel like it's just kind of a translation to things that matter to me so that I can empathize with people and be like, oh, they were dealing with a very real thing, and this was how they understood it, and this was the story they told, and this is how they dealt with it. And so I really enjoy them. I really enjoy that kind of connection. But if it's done in a way that's just like, look how stupid people were 200 years ago, I'm just like, they didn't have microscopes. Like, what did you want them to do? You know, like, that's not their fault.
Like, did you know bacteria existed until you were taught it in school and looked at a microscope and been like, oh, that's a creature.
Yeah! Like, that doesn't mean they're dumb.
Yeah.
They have, like, relevant intelligence related to their time and environment. Like, that's kind of how I
like
feel.
what you said about it being, like, a tool for translation.
Yeah.
Like, understanding how to talk to someone else about something. Because that's what we're all doing, right? Is, like, coming up with shared language so we can share an experience, you know? Like, yes, there are, like, medical, like, conditions we can name to explain exactly what's happening in our body, or I could just shorthand and say, I have cramps today. And you, like, know what I'm talking about. In the same way that, like, they didn't really know what was happening, but they're like, I don't know, man, like, vampires. And someone else in the next neighborhood would be like, oh yeah, heard about the vampires. We're on alert. You know, something bad's going down. This is our shorthand for, like, we don't know what it is, but something's happening. So I found the medical explanations, like, kind of interesting. Honestly, if someone just, like, tries to stop the conversation with, like, well, vampires were never real. And I'm like, well, duh. It was actually this medical condition. I was like, okay, cool. Do you still want to talk about vampires, though? Like, yeah. Like, that's not the end. And in fact, you know, so much of our vampire, like, written down stories come after we understand more about how viruses work, but they're still fascinating to read. And we see this continuance of using vampires to talk about plagues and viruses and disease throughout storytelling, even into the modern age. This section, part 2, from the imagination to the page. How we got these folk stories, these superstitions, these ideas from Eastern Europe into the 18th and 19th century vampire literature of the West. So as I mentioned, the Germans and Austrians are coming back. And one of the first, kind of pinned as like the first written down vampire narrative, is the vampire in German. How would you pronounce that?
So, Der Vampire. Something along those lines.
Der Vampire.
Der Vampire.
Der Vampire.
Der. Great.
So during this, you know, the Great Vampire Epidemic, one of the first poems comes out, The Vampire, 1748, by Heinrich August Ossenfelder. I apologize, I could not find the name of the English translator for the version that Julia's going to read for us. It's a short little poem, though, and if it doesn't seem like the meter works and it doesn't rhyme, remember, it was originally in German. Okay, here we go.
All right. Dear Vampire, my dear young maiden clingeth, unbending, fast and firm, to all the long-held teaching of a mother ever true, as in vampires unmortal, folk on the Thases portal, Hayduck-like do believe, You're going to explain those?
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll come back to that.
But my Christine, thou dost dally, and wilt my loving parry, till I myself avenging to a vampire's health a drinking, him toast in pale Tokay, and as softly thou art sleeping, to thee shall I come creeping, and thy life's blood drain away, and so shall thou be trembling, for thus shall I be kissing. Oh. And death's threshold, though it crossing, with fear in my cold arms, and last shall I thee question, compared to such instruction, what are a mother's charms? Well, there's a fun twist halfway through here.
Okay, a couple of those words. The Thasi or Tiza, I'm not sure how to say it. It's a river, the biggest river in Hungary. So folks on like the river's portal. Hajduk is a semi-military official in Hungary, so like officials do believe.
Gotcha. Okay.
Is what that line is. And then Tokay, him toast in pale Tokay, it's a Hungarian wine. So
Gotcha.
There's a few like Hungarian references in there. But fun fact time before we get into analyzing this poem. So
Great.
Hold the poem in your brain. New fun fact. The King of Hungary, Emperor Franz Joseph, he had a tradition of sending Queen Victoria the Tokay wine as a gift every year for her birthday. 1 bottle for every month she had lived. So on her 81st birthday in 1900, he gave her 972 bottles of wine.
How, why? There's no way she could drink that much.
Like, rich folks doing stupid things. Yeah, it's just
That's
like one of those things like,
insane.
I'm going to send you a bottle of wine. Like, you turned, I don't know when he started this.
Not for every year she lived. Every month?
I
Oh
guess
my
she's
god.
throwing big Hungarian wine parties.
Good lord.
She's 81. You can't. She did not get through those 972 bottles in her lifetime.
No.
Let me tell you.
Rich people, man.
Doing wild shit. So in Osenfelder's Vampire, we start to see some of these key themes come together, which again, you might read this or hear this, and if you can hear past the Hungarian references and the old-timey English, you might be like, typical vampire shit. But this is really new shit. So notably, the sexual element of the vampire attacks, like a vampire attacking someone, is new in this poem. So far from what I've read and from what others have read and have said in their work, is that part of the original folklore and the reports of like vampire attacks did not include a sexual component.
Interesting.
It was more just like they got consumption and died. They were bled to death. And so this is Osenfelder kind of putting a creative change into the mythology, and it really stuck. So we have this key theme of being predatory, especially towards virgins. We have blood drinking associated with kissing, alluding towards sex. Ultimately, the death of the human. This vampire is also cold to the touch, and we get an unmortal or immortal vampire here. What's absolutely fascinating to me about this is that this poem was commissioned by the editor of a scientific journal, which I'm like, what kind of scientific journals did they have in Germany in the 18th century? But apparently one that published poetry alongside articles. And this was published alongside an article of reported vampire activity.
Wow.
So it was him taking creative liberties with literature, but also at a time, again, we're still in the Great Vampire Epidemic of Serbia, like at a time when people were still very much like, vampire attacks are happening. And also, let me write a poem about it and infuse it with my own ideas.
That's so interesting. Is there any analysis of like the purpose? Is there a theory that maybe Western Europeans at the time were doing that kind of classic outsider fear thing of like, he's coming for your daughters? Like the sexual threat of an outsider is something we see a lot with other groups that hate each other.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm curious if they had a purpose behind it or if it was like meant to entertain only, you know?
Yeah, I don't know. I would be really curious. I didn't dig around deep enough to find like the article it was published with. And even then, if I found it, I don't know if I find an English translation of it that I would be able to read. Honestly, that note about it being published in a scientific journal, I found like 10 minutes before we hit record.
Oh
so
my
like
God.
I was like, wait, this is fascinating. Throw this one in there. So yes, I'm really curious about that. I thought it was just like, oh, some dude started writing poetry about like weird stories that he was hearing from the East, but it was a commission.
Like, I wonder if the commission asked him to include that theme in there because there was some kind of like sexually transmitted disease issue happening. You know what I mean? Like, what did they ask for versus what was him throwing things in of his own volition? Yeah, the fact that there's like multiple people involved in the creation of that is very interesting to me because that suggests a more institutional level perspective of what a vampire represents and kind of how it functioned in Western Europe versus where it came from. Okay, what's next?
Yeah, so the next like piece of vampire literature that really like makes a mark is at the end of the 1700s. We get another German poem by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and he writes The Bride of Corinth. I won't have us read it. We won't dive into it. It's really fascinating. It's kind of a reinterpretation of a Greek myth, the story of Philemon, and there's a she-demon returning from the dead in the original Greek myth. And so Goethe kind of takes that and fuses it with some vampire lore. And so now we're starting to see like vampire as literary tool, as like a literary trope of like, I want to tell a story, but interesting new twist for the late 18th century. We're going to take Greek myths and add some vampires. So this is one of the first like written female vampires. And we get the tropes again of a cold body. There's in summary, it's two young lovers that have been promised to each other. And the man comes to his betrothed's house to get married, comes in the dead of night, isn't really welcomed by anyone but the mother. And in the night, his new lover comes to him, but she's different because something happened and now she's a vampire. Some sort of curse or trade, unclear, that her mom made to never let her daughter consummate her marriage. And eventually the daughter asks in the end for her own death to end it by fire. And so we also get these ideas of vampires not dying in normal human ways and needing something extra so that they don't come back to life. As we transition into the 19th century and we get the emergence of the novel as a popular literary form, we start to get our vampire novels. We get Polidori's The Vampire, written in 1819. That famous writing retreat.
Writer's retreat!
The OG writer's retreat, Lord Byron, with his friends at a house, has a little writing competition. This is where Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Polidori was Byron's travel companion and doctor. They've been traveling together for years.
Travel companion.
In quotes. Polidori writes the story that is called The Vampire. It is the story of Aubrey, an orphaned, wealthy young man, and Lord Ruthven, a suave, sinister nobleman with very pale skin, and very clearly modeled off of Lord Byron.
Did he just write sexy fanfiction about himself and his quote-unquote travel companion? Is that what this is?
He drags Lord Byron in this novel. This is notably at the end of Polidori and Byron's time together, before Polidori gets fired.
This is like their breakup album.
So this Lord Ruthven character, again, don't know who he's based off of. What? He just pops up in London high society and is getting to know people, and Aubrey's like, cool dude, we should travel around the continent together. And so a lot of weird things come up about Ruthven, some suspicions. Aubrey is like a little like, ooh, maybe I was a little short-sighted to take this guy with me on my travels. Maybe I distance myself. Aubrey goes off, has his own adventures, meets a woman who tells him about vampires, and Aubrey's like, oh no, connecting the dots. But it's too late. Ruthven has already been attached to Aubrey's life and finds out his love interest, kills her, and later reemerges. Even when you think Ruthven should have died, and he comes, tricks everyone into forgetting who he is except Aubrey, and Aubrey gets to watch as he seduces Aubrey's sister and eventually kills her after their wedding night. So, yeah.
Wow. Taylor Swift
Monsters.
Who? I only know Polidori. Incredible.
It was a hit. I will not get into all the details here, but Polidori's novel was particularly a hit with the theater kids. Everyone was like, OMG, let's adapt it. Nodier adapts it into the French. Planchet takes it to the English. There's a German guy who writes a play that his brother-in-law turns into an opera. And it takes over Western Europe as like an idea. So we have Polidori's vampire, who's pretty much stayed consistent, but also everyone's done their own take on it for all these different stage adaptations.
Do they also all have beef with Lord Byron? Or or like, did they read this and they were like, I know exactly who this is about? I'm obsessed with this.
At first, when I was reading about Polidori, and the first thing I read about it was like, oh, and it kind of, pseudo Lord Byron. And I was like, okay, interesting. I pull up the original text. Polidori puts the novel in between two letters where he calls out Lord Byron. Like, it's not subtle.
Because, okay, imagine. So you've been invited to the home, the guy you've been traveling Europe with. You get trapped there on a rainy night, and he suggests, let's all write some scary literature and try to scare each other. And you've been fighting, he's been being a dick and philandering off with women, you're jealous as hell. Your relationship's been on the rocks, and so you sit down and you write this book while you're in his house. That is iconic and petty and so many layers of incredible.
It is quite sad. I mean, Polidori publishes The Vampire in 1819. He dies only 2 years later.
Ah, so he didn't get to see all the adaptations.
Yeah. And so he didn't even get to see fully how much his work took off. Like, it was adapted to stage in his last years. But like the opera came out like many years later after his passing. So we start to get, this common, like, cultural touchstone of the vampire story. Even if you're not familiar with the folklore, you've heard of Polidori because you've seen the plays and you've seen the opera. Vampires are also used as social critique, not only in these novels, but in satire. Something I found fascinating is that the satire about vampires in, like, England and Ireland, it was fairly early in, like, the 19th century. There's this satire drawing called Natural History of Two Species of Irish Vampire. And it's like, Julie, do you want to describe to our listeners what this image is, if you can figure it out?
What is his nose doing? We have a woman lying on her back. She's half naked. She's sort of wrapped in cloth from the waist down. Very dramatically posed on a rock in the light. On her arm is like a dead baby. There are two creatures that honestly just look like monkeys in hats. Okay. The first one, and I read the alt text. The OG alt text that explains
the description at the bottom of the comic.
Yes, that explains what's happening here. So the two quote-unquote species of vampires, the one on the left is a monkey man in a top hat laying on his side, and apparently he has this long snoot that they're calling a proboscis, like a butterfly. And from a great distance across a river, across the channel, is this perhaps the English? It is drawing her heart's blood. It looks so stupid, but that he's supposed to be sinister, I think. And then the other one, he's wearing a Pope hat, and he's in fluffy white clothes that really defy gravity here. Sort of wing-like. Maybe he has a tail. Can't figure what that is in the middle. But again, looks like a monkey wearing a Pope hat. And he is sucking blood directly from her throat. So I'm guessing the church and the English, we hate them. And then there's like a floating lyre in the sky, which is usually used to represent Ireland. Yeah. So I'd be like, the Irish hate the English and the Catholics? Is that... Or are these the Protestants?
It's the opposite, because the title is Natural History of Two Species of Irish Vampire.
Oh.
So my read is that the prone woman is supposed to be
She's
England.
supposed to be English. Ah.
And on the tree above her, we have written depression, some other word I can't read, famine, and pestilence. The Catholic Irish sucking from her neck, and the absentee, like far away, sucking her dry of her life's blood.
So these are British people painting an image of the Irish as evil welfare suckers, basically.
So we get this idea of like vampire as, sucking creature, and it's used a lot in social critique. This was 1831 is when this comic was published.
So it's basically like ways for you to express how much you hate people who are different from you.
Yeah, continuing this idea of like the vampire that sucks you dry, taking the life force, and using it as a derogatory term too, right? Like calling Ireland a vampire is, analogous to saying like they're other than us, they're taking from us. And we've seen this continued social critique even today to, people being called a vampire for like...
Olivia Rodrigo.
Yeah, like Olivia Rodrigo still uses the vampire as an idea of someone who sucks you dry. Yeah. A leech, yes. I'm going to transition us into the last couple books and topics we're going to talk about. We have a whole episode on 1872 Le Fanu's Carmilla that was published. I won't say much here because you can go listen to an hour of us talking about this particular vampire novel, but I will note the narrative approach of this novel in the form of letters. And so this idea of, it was popular in this late 19th century novel to say, hey, what I'm writing is really real. Like, this actually happened. And here's, like, the letters of this certain scientist or physician confirming this is a real thing. And so we get that introduced with Carmilla, and we see it again with the style of Dracula. And it's kind of like a hallmark move, especially in vampire literature, that contemporary authors have executed as well. We were talking earlier about, like, when you know a trope, it's even more fun when you see it. So if you read the prologue to Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, the 2010 novel by Seth Grahame-Smith, you're like, what is this? Seth Grahame-Smith writes as himself about how he came across the exclusive journal of Abraham Lincoln, the one that's not redacted, that includes all the vampire hunting. And that sets the stage for the rest of the book, which is written in kind of a historical narrative where he's intersplicing parts of the journal with his summation of what happened in Abraham Lincoln's life. So if you see that come up in your reading of vampire novels, know that they're harkening back to this early tradition established with Le Fanu's Carmilla.
I wonder, it's interesting to me that really only sticks around with vampires, even though this was a very common practice for novels, period. I mean, even Frankenstein does it.
Yeah.
Like, that's where the novel came from, was just epistolary collections that were claiming to be real, and that's how we transition into fiction over time. So that's interesting that, like, it's become associated specifically as a trope with vampire novels. I wonder if it's something with, like, vampires being old, we want it to feel like it has history.
I think it's a combination of that, and the vampire attack can be sudden. It can also be a very drawn-out process. So there's this common trope of a vampire who comes to visit every night. And so to keep the suspense, having it written in a journal format where someone's dealing with the day-to-day and not sure what this mystery is that's, like, piling up, I feel like the epistolary style really works to create that suspense and that fear that's prolonged over a period of time in a way that other monsters are more acute in their attacks.
Yeah.
So we're going to briefly step away from novels to mention the travel memoir by Emily Gerard. Emily Gerard in 1888 published a travel memoir called The Land Beyond the Forest, Facts, Figures, and Fancies from Transylvania. So she went with her English military husband while he was traveling through what is called Transylvania, Romania, and she just wrote about her times. Notably, she has a whole chapter about Romanian folklore on vampires and werewolves. And Stoker owned a copy of this memoir, and in his collection of his, like, library that his children and other descendants have maintained and, like, portioned off to other libraries, you can find his copy that has all the notes that he took of that chapter that inspired his story of Dracula. She was just an educated woman on her travels. So a lot of these ideas too, I mean, they're going through multiple filters, right? So it's like Romanian folklore translated by an English woman who stopped by for a while and written down, and then Stoker taking that to kind of expand out his world of Dracula, published in 1897. It was only moderately successful in his lifetime, but for some reason, this one stuck. Dracula is the vampire we know. Before you know anything about vampires, you've probably even heard of Dracula as a monster or a creature that comes back. And there's like 127 years of Dracula motifs and films and things we can talk about, but I'm going to land with just the last and first one. Last one of this episode, but first film of Dracula was Nosferatu, which is also a bastardized Romanian word that was mistranslated.
Oh, interesting.
It's a silent film, the German expressionist style. It was an unauthorized and unofficial adaptation of Dracula, where they took everything and wholesale moved it to Germany. Everyone has got German names. They're in Germany. It's about Germany. And it notably introduced a key addition to vampire lore, which is the end. Spoiler for a 1922 movie, but end of the movie, the vampire is killed because the sun rises and he immediately burns to a crisp in the sunlight. Stoker's Dracula was just weakened in the sunlight, not going to die. Funnily enough, there was a copyright case with Stoker's descendants and all the copies had to be destroyed. Though, of course, some survived, and it is cited as an influential piece of cinema and specifically horror. Definitely you see the strong themes of fear of the other in this film, very anti-Semitic tones, as their other was very Jewish, because it was 1922 Germany.
I mean, there are in the original, like, Dracula as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of it's talking about the other, and the authors and creators of these things had different ideas of who the other was. So over time, we're going to pause at 1922. Mm-hmm. There's continual use of vampires as monsters to reflect the concerns of the time. We're critiquing society, especially religion, sexuality, foreigners, the other, through this time period. And even today, we still have a lot of, like, monster vampires. But eventually we start to see a shift towards more sympathetic vampires, notably Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire, where we start to hear more from the vampires and not just the victims. So in the rest of the series of The Vampire and the Octopus, we'll be looking at a couple books that have the sympathetic vampires, and so we'll dig more into those tropes as they play on the original tropes, but in a very different approach.
What are the themes we're going to be focusing on then to prepare us for this coming series?
So the first three are core elements of the vampire. So the vampire as sexual deviant, as a cursed immortal, and as the invading foreigner. So I'll dig into each of those through our specific book episodes, but to give a little taste, we're going to take each of those themes, talk about what I define them as, and use Bram Stoker's Dracula as an example to work with. So the sexual deviant. So since Osenfelder's The Vampire poem, vampire literature has pretty consistently dealt with themes of sexual predation and sexual deviance. So in many ways, classical, like older writing and even today, like writing a vampire encounter is another way to talk about sexuality, to talk about rape, to talk about consent, whether or not it happens. And vampires have been a way to talk about sex. Not every vampire novel is like sexy, but all of them are sensual. We're dealing with the body, we're dealing with blood and what is taken from you and what is given. And so, for example, in Stoker's Dracula, we have our vampire preying on virgins, so that sexual predation. We also have his harem of female vampires, which is seen as sexual deviance, as not the norm. It's flagged as like this weird thing the vampire does, having all these female vampires with him. The cursed immortal. So from the very earliest rumblings of vampires, we have the idea of vampires as unholy, as cursed beings, as pagan. And so whether the vampire-specific story lives forever or rises from the dead or just lives for a very long time, our vampires stories have creatures that are typically anti-Christian in some way or anti-religious and walk this earth longer than humans do. They're dealing with some sort of curse and their immortality. So in Stoker, we have our monster who is only defeated in the end by the power of God and these Christian white men who come in to save the day. Dracula is seen as a demonic creature, as described with a lot of words around being a demon, being evil, and he needs to be destroyed in a very particular way to be gone forever. Otherwise, he is difficult or impossible to kill.
Okay, so see, that's interesting, because immediately when I hear cursed immortal, I think someone who is cursed to be immortal, like being a vampire, being immortal is a curse. Mm-hmm. And, you know, you feel sympathy for the person who has to deal with living that way. Whereas, like, what you're describing here, what we see in Dracula is, like, they are cursed as in evil.
And I think you picked up on exactly why I phrased it this way, because there are a lot of vampire stories that talk about the curse of being immortal.
Right.
And, like, how difficult it is. There's I don't know if it's like a writing exercise, somewhere between a writing exercise and a board game that's been described to me, where you are a vampire that lives for thousands of years, but you have to decide what you're forgetting. Because you're just cursed with immortality to live forever, but you have to you can't remember everything. You can't hold on to everything. And so you have to figure out what parts of your life you forget, which is a really interesting way to think about immortality. And some of the older vampire stories like Dracula, we also have the immortality is seen as a curse because there is no place in heaven for this creature. Mm-hmm. The Christian conception of heaven is immortality, life forever, but life in a better place. Whereas the vampire is cursed to be immortal in this realm and to not have access to heaven. You are picking up what I'm putting down. There's a lot of ways to take cursed immortal, and a lot of authors have played with that idea in fascinating ways.
I guess it depends on whose perspective you're looking at, basically.
Yeah, and if you have a sympathetic vampire, or if you have a vampire we want to hate. And my third theme I wanted to focus on is this idea we've talked about a lot, the invading foreigner. So similar as how we discussed the octopus in the last episode as being a symbol for the other, the vampire is often from somewhere else and invading someone's sense of safety. So we get a sense of who we're afraid of at different periods of time based on what vampires we have. So with Nosferatu, it's a vampire that's, wow, very Jewish. And the Germans are othering that character. In Stoker's Dracula, the English are othering the Eastern European and seeing that as an invading force. Mm-hmm. In more modern books, which we'll look into because all the books I've picked for this are 21st century novels, we get a lot of different ideas of what it means to be a foreigner, what it means to be invading. And again, intentionally using those words to think about them from multiple perspectives.
Yeah.
So I had these 3 core themes. I felt really good about them. And I told Julie about this a month ago. I'm I got my 3 themes, just doing all my research. It's going to be great. But in the process of prepping this episode, I came across a literary scholar who wrote about how the theme of justice is a core thread in vampire novels. I cannot find the source on that because I closed my tabs last night I am desperate to find it. I was digging through my browser history before we hit record and I can't find it. But I'll link it in the show notes if I do because I want to credit the person who had this idea because I thought it was brilliant and so true, and I want to talk about it in each of the books that we'll get into. But this is a key piece. Whether we're championing the vampire or we're championing the victims, in a vampire story, we're really concerned with justice.
Yeah.
So in one of the books I picked out, we see vampires who are struggling with what it means to be an ethical being and to pursue justice on behalf of victims they perceived as wronged and not finding justice in the world otherwise. So the vampire turns to hunt the monsters of human society. We have another story where vampires are seducing and attacking very vulnerable people, and the story follows the community work to fight back and seek justice for the victims when no one believes them. And lastly, we have a story of a vampire community that has established their own laws and rules, and we get to look at what happens when vampires go against community standards and how they create justice in their vampire world, and what that means as a reader in our world. What is the author talking to? So I'm excited to dig into the 3 novels I've picked out. You'll just have to come back to hear what books I'm doing.
Yeah. Wow.
What are you most interested to dig into as we read? We've heard a lot about old vampire stories from the 18th and 19th centuries, early 20th century. What are you interested to see about vampire novels of the 21st?
This is not answering the question, but I'm just so stuck on the fact that it's just such a classic Western European move to go and experience someone else's culture and learn about their monsters and what they're afraid of, and then go back home and get it wrong and add a bunch of new shit and then use that thing as a symbol for the people that you were hanging out with. That's just the most Western European move. And then that's the version that becomes popular. Like genies, right? We talked about genies with 8 billion genies. Everything that in America we think we know about genies comes from some French dude who completely butchered a translation. And he just made a bunch of shit up. I'm really stuck on that. I guess then what I'm most excited about is to see how people, I guess maybe reclaim would be the word. Not that any of the authors that we're going to be reading are Eastern European necessarily, but I'm very curious to see how people who have been othered in their society use vampires to like tell stories and kind of take it back from the people who cast them out, you know?
Yeah.
I think that's the thing I find most compelling at the end of the day. And like, how do you, like, I love anything where people are like, yeah, I'm that kind of monster. What about it? You know, and anything like that, I find very fun and powerful and encouraging and just so many things. You know, I feel validated also in my my desire not to take vampires too seriously, because so much of the literary traditions I've inherited are, every single book, it sounds like, had such an agenda to it. You know what I mean? Like, it was specifically trying to slag off someone. Lord Byron. Or the, you know, Eastern Europeans, or whatever it is. It doesn't deserve our reverence, but we can still use it as something interesting. So, yeah, I guess that's what I'm excited for.
Yeah. And I think, like, what has stayed consistent in vampire novels, especially the ones I've picked out for us to read together, is this idea of, like, there is someone to dislike, you know? But what's different is that we are women of the 21st century, and the books we're reading are, the dislikable characters are abusive men.
Yes.
And racist folks who want to destroy people just for being different. And those are the villains. And so we can maybe get behind it in a different way. At its core, it's doing the same thing. It's just, we're not 19th century British women who are afraid of, you know, Eastern European folks. We're American women afraid of men in the night who are being predatory and stalking people and abusing power, things like that. So I would say a lot has stayed the same, and that's kind of what that theme of justice is pointing to. It's just like, who, like, when we read Dracula, it's interesting because I don't really take Mina's side, but I can feel for her. But I'm not like, oh yeah, Dracula's the absolute worst. He is also a monster, but also I can, like, see what's happening in the page.
Because you see the author's hand so strongly and stuff like that. So you're seeing his interpretation of what justice would be in this situation. Yeah.
So we'll get to dig into this so much more. First one we're reading especially has a lot to do with the invading foreigner and a whole new look at what that means. So get ready. Until then, let us know what vampires you love, what octopuses are still on your mind today. We've picked our books, but we can always have more recommendations. Honestly, I could do this series as long as I have a good vampire book. I just only have 3 right now that I want to do. So send us your recs, and happy reading.
Bye, everybody.
This has been an episode of The Vampire and the Octopus, a special series from Book Club with Julie and Victoria. Thanks for listening, and thank you to our members who keep the show going. You can support the show and also receive access to exclusive bonus content, including our film club, newsletters, and archive of the first 50 episodes of the show at buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjb. This episode was co-hosted and produced by myself, Victoria Bruick, and Julia Clausen. Our music is composed by Greg Bruick. Our logo was designed by Gabby Thubland. We want to know what you're reading and your bookish thoughts, so you can reach us at our website, bookclubwithjb.com, on Instagram at bookclubwithjb, or by leaving a review on Apple or Spotify. We'll catch you next time. Happy reading.